Okay, are we? Oh, we are.
Are we live?
We're on.
Yes.
We're live.
Yes.
Live from San Francisco, California.
So, welcome to day 2 of Scala Days. We have one schedule change to announce. Today at 2:30, Duncan DeVore was going to be presenting reactive reference architectures. Duncan couldn't make it, so in his place there will be a very similar talk called Reactive Reference Architecture, singular. And that will be presented by Nilanjan Raychaudhuri and Marcus Jura.
It's we've been told it's very similar material, so if you were interested in the first one, you should go to this one. Okay, a couple of things we missed last night. Bold Radius is holding a scavenger hunt. You can find out more information at their booth. They have booty. They have an Apple Watch as the prize, I think. And Nitro is running an unconference, so if you want, this is after the conference. If anybody's not familiar, an unconference is like a conference but without people standing up in front of you talking. People actually talk to one another. It's this crazy concept where everybody talks to one another. It's like amazingly good. And
if you want to go to the unconference, please register in advance at Nitro's table.
Yes, I missed the most important point there, didn't I, really? In my enthusiasm. And there's a party tonight, St. Paddy's Day party right here. There'll be drinks and foods and stuff like that. So,
TypeSafe wanted us to remind you to encourage you to use the Scala Days hashtag on Twitter to tell your friends what's going on here. And I think that's it for announcements.
Yes, I think so.
All right. So our keynote speaker today is Danese Coope. Her CV includes a list of tech giants, Apple, Sun, Intel. She's at PayPal now, heading up their open source effort. Her CV is also a laundry list of open source giants. She's been involved with the Open Source Initiative, Mozilla Foundation, Apache Software, and others. She was instrumental in the open sourcing of the JDK when she was at Sun, so we all owe her a thanks for, as Scala programmers, that we're on top of an open source stack.
And because you guys already know that, this is well known, we actually talked to Denise backstage and found out some facts about Denise. And these are of the some say category. 2 of them are actually true. See if you can figure out which ones. So, some say Denise was actually named after a unique racing car. At the tender age of 5, she won the World Zero-G Yo-Yo Championship in Tokyo. She then went on, at 8 years old, to become a hula hoop champion. And she's the open source diva because opensourceoverlord.org was already taken. All we know is she's called Danese Coope.
Please welcome her.
Thanks, guys. Hi there. Nice to be here. Oh, right. The clicker. So I'm here today to talk to you about why open languages win. You guys are Scala guys, so you already like open languages. How many of you code in Java? Good. How about, keep your hands up if you also know Python? Good. How about JavaScript? Yeah. I learned yesterday that JavaScript is outselling every other language in terms of book sales across all publishers worldwide, which is kind of fascinating, I think. Right after that is Java and C++ and then Python, which I find interesting. Anyway, so I'm here today to talk to you about why open languages win. Do you guys know what this is? How many of you know what these guys are? Anybody? Spy versus spy, that's right. Can you tell which one is the open language? It's actually the one on the right, or the white one, because we're dynamite. All right, first I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm not your normal technologist. My degree is actually in French literature. So of course my first job was working in a law firm, inevitably. because what are you going to do otherwise, right? And I didn't actually start coding until pretty late in life. I did it because it's where the money was, and I was at the time between husbands, and I was supporting a kid, and I needed to make as much money as possible. Proof that anybody can do it at any age, so think about that. People always ask me, how did you get into open source? Well, I'm going to tell you, I was at Apple, that bastion of open technologies. I loved working for Apple. It was my first tech company, and I can't say enough good things about them. They gave me the opportunity to learn how to code because they actually beam Stanford instructional television into the offices. And if you pay attention, you can take a whole CS degree, like sitting at your desk, which is awesome. But I was working on something called QuickTime conferencing. Has anybody ever heard of it? Yeah, there you go. So what QuickTime conferencing was, first of all, it was obviously based on QuickTime. The QuickTime team didn't like QuickTime conferencing because half of the engineers left QuickTime to work on QuickTime conferencing, which was the idea that QuickTime could beam over the interwebs, which was a really, really edgy idea at the time. So if you guys watch YouTube, you can thank these guys because they did all the foundational research to make it happen. But as I said, the QuickTime team wasn't happy about this defection because they had a vision of QuickTime getting better and better on a single desktop, and they wanted to take on the film editing world, like Avid, right? So what did they do? Well, they locked the QuickTime conferencing team out of their code base, completely locked them out. They were black boxing their code. Not this black box exactly, but I thought it was, topical. And it was incredibly inefficient to write that way. And it really pissed me off. So then I went to, who knows what this is? Symantec. And I learned a ton at Symantec. I learned that not every developer is a rocket scientist. You guys might have known this already, but I didn't know. So I worked with a team of developers that were not, frankly, the best developers I've ever seen. They were really nice people. They worked really hard. Lucky for us, management all looked the other way right as I was coming in. And I got the middle managers together and I said, what if we ran this project the way you read about in school? Wouldn't that be cool? And at the time, everybody did waterfall. Waterfall. Took, 18 months for anything to ever get released. And so we did an experiment in agility. And we raised the pirate flag. We really did. And we built agile teams. We got people started on this project. And lo and behold, we were done so much faster. The quality was so much better. But the important thing from Symantec's point of view was we documented everything we were doing on an internal website. So in a way, we open sourced it. And it was totally revolutionary for them. They'd never seen anything like this. They thought this was the coolest thing ever. Well, one day, I was having sushi in a sushi bar that used to be a dentist's office on Deanza Boulevard, which is right in the middle of Apple world, right? Also Symantec world at the time. And this woman tapped me on the shoulder and she said, would you like to open source Java? This really happened to me. Now, we were talking about the agility and them redoing their technology, redoing their engineering, and she overheard all of this, and she thought this would be an interesting play. And it turned out Sun thought it would be interesting because I had the legal background, and they thought that open source was about legal language and being able to talk legal language and explain legal language. So I took the job, right? Now we're going to go into a sidebar about standards. How many of you have sat on a standards body? Oh, thank God. All right. Here's what I think, right? I think standards bodies are really, really, really past the shark, way past the shark. And the reason is because they're slow, like the Loris, really slow. They usually are building unnecessary complexity. You'd think that they'd be going for simplicity. But what actually happens is the vested interests get at the table and they all want their special thing in there, and pretty soon you've got Corba or something like that that isn't actually fully implementable and nobody actually cares about anyway, right? And meanwhile, the internet and the rest of the world is moving like this. So I actually think standards bodies are gone now, although they still exist. If you need any more evidence, all you have to look at is OOXML, which was approved through ISO because Microsoft basically bought ISO to get it approved. It's just, there's no bearing that I can see in most of these bodies. And people who live in the standards world get really upset when I say this because they believe that they're doing good work. And they are. It's just not, it's an old game they're playing, and they need to up their game, I think. All right, so I'm at Sun. And I've taken this job, and I'm standing up in front of crowds like you, and I'm talking about open Java, open source Java. Meanwhile, Sun does not want to open source Java. They really don't. The reason that they got in the pickle in the first place around open Java is because they had a senior vice president named Alan Baratz, who was the first ever vice president of all the engineering, because Sun was a famously siloed company, but they decided that all the engineering should be under one guy sometime in 1997, and that guy was Alan Baratz. And in late 1998, in Tokyo, Japan, he stood up on stage and said that Java would be open sourced in 1999, and got great applause and came home and left the company. It's a true story. So these guys are stuck with this press release, and they want to be sexy, they're cowboys, they want to do the right thing, sort of, but they also want to monetize, and they can't figure out how those two things play. So they create this fake license, not an open source license, called the Scala, or Sun Community Source License. And before I was the open source diva, I was the Scala goddess. Set it on my business card. Because they wanted me to explain Scala to the world and make people like Scala. Well, it didn't take very long for me to realize that people really didn't like Scala. What they didn't like about it was a hub and spoke model. Everything had to go through Sun. It wasn't forkable code by any stretch of the imagination. It wasn't an open source license. So I quit because I got tired of, rotten eggs. About 6 months in, and I wasn't mad or anything. I just walked into my boss's office and said, I think I'm wasting my time and your time, and I'd really like to be doing something more impactful, so I'm going to leave. And what I didn't know was that my timing was impeccable. And I didn't plan it, but it turns out that unemployment in the valley was down to like 0.5%. And they were begging the janitors to stay because they couldn't afford to lose a single employee. And so they said, well, what would keep you here? And, if anybody ever asks you that question, shoot for the moon. Why wouldn't you, right? So I said, well, I think you need an executive presence in open source, and I think you need to make friends with the open source community because you've pissed them all off, but you're going to need them to be your friends. So why don't you make me your chief open source evangelist? And they said, yes. Turns out you can make your own luck if you don't really care what the outcome is. So my advice to you as workers is remember this story. Okay, so now I'm the first officer for open source in any corporation, and what am I going to do with it? Well, of course, we ended up open sourcing a bunch of stuff that wasn't Java. We did OpenOffice, we did NetBeans, which was getting close to Java. We did Genie, which was also kind of getting close to Java. But the family jewels at Sun were Solaris and Java, and they weren't open sourcing those anytime soon. I went to my first meeting about opening Solaris in 1999. And, if they had done it then, would Linux have gotten the same purchase that it has? I don't think so, right? They couldn't, because the way they did development involved writing a lot of deals with other companies, and those deals didn't contemplate the need to put the source code out. So they couldn't go back and renegotiate. They didn't really want to. And so they had to somehow pull all that spaghetti code out. Anyway, but in the case of Java, what was really happening was two 6,000-pound gorillas were fighting it out. It was C++ versus Java. And it's still C++ versus Java today. This fight is not over yet. But everything else was kind of collateral damage in this crazy war that they were having. So Sun did something disruptive. And big companies, when they're really pushed to the wall, will do something disruptive with open source. It's probably the best use of open source from a big company perspective. What they did was they put Tomcat, the servlet API, out at Apache, because they didn't want people adopting active server pages, and they were willing to sacrifice a piece of Java to gain a foothold with the community and get broader usage. And it worked brilliantly, right? So the only problem was now they're at Apache and they're having to deal with real open source people, and they can't tell them what open source is, which proved really problematic. So pretty soon we had Sun versus Apache going on. And it was an ugly range war. I don't know how many of you watched that war, but I'm going to tell you about one of the very early skirmishes. So we had put Apache on the JCP as a way to show how open it was. And I, being myself, when I was talking to the Apache people about doing this, I was really clear with them. I said, I think they're just going to use you as kind of show dolls. You know, I don't think you're actually going to convince them to change much. You're just going to be out there and they're going to be able to point at you and say open source, right? If you're comfortable with that. And what I didn't get, but I now do because I've been an Apache member for 10 years now, Apache knows that big companies are going to use them that way. It's part of the design. They believe so much in the power of open source to sort of fix everything that they don't mind being seen as dupes of IBM or Sun or any big company that comes in and puts a technology there, because they really believe that that permissive licensing and that community over code value is going to eventually win, no matter how evil of the project it turns out. So they were willing to be put in this position. Well, a couple of years later, Sun wanted to renegotiate the agreement that you used in order to be in the Java community process. And, excuse me, probably get some water. And they were going through iterations of legal contracts. And there was a guy from Apache that was reading every one of these contracts and then trying to ask good questions. Except he wasn't a lawyer. He hadn't really thought about law much. So what he used to do is send them to me. And I would read them, and I would give him the questions I would ask, given this legal language. And the reason I was able to do that was because JavaSoft, by that point, had decided that I had gone native, and so they didn't invite me to the meetings from the Sun side. But my job was to make friends with the open source community, so I was being helpful. Right? Well, one day I wrote a set of questions for him. One of them was, could you do Tomcat under this agreement? And the answer, it's important to know that those meetings were always a vice president and a lawyer. But in this particular meeting, the vice president was missing. And so the lawyer just sort of told the truth, which he never should have done. But what he said was, oh God, I don't think even Sun could do Tomcat under this agreement. This is basically reproprietizing Java. That's what they're telling me to do. And the Apache guys said, thank you very much. And they went back home and wrote inside to Apache membership, they're proprietizing Java, we're going to have to pull out. And they got everybody really riled up inside of Apache, right? So then there's a summit meeting with all the VPs involved with Java, all the VPs involved with Apache, and they reach a compromise. And the compromise is that they will be allowed to re-implement Java as long as they do it compatibly. And the way that compatibility will be established is because they're able to pass the compatibility test kit, the same one that everybody has to pass. But it's expensive to do that. It's not a cheap test to be involved with, because standards bodies are, another thing that's wrong with them is they're all about money, right? So it's a profit center for Sun. So they decide they're going to give Apache a grant to allow them to do this TCK work. Well, for us, this was memorialized on stage, and how this happened tells you everything about how companies work. Now, I want you to remember, these are not open source languages yet, but all this backstory is the stuff you never hear about because it's behind closed doors. So the guy in the middle of this picture is Jason Hunter. He was the vice president for Apache for Java. Now, this is his 5 minutes of fame. He is on stage at Java 1. Have you guys ever been to Java 1? Anybody? Right, 28,000 live people in a room. It's the scariest keynote you'll ever give. Because as you're giving it, the diamond screen is picking you up and taking you further and further back in the hall. And you can hear your jokes echoing down the hall. It's really terrifying. I was there once with Tim O'Reilly, and he was shaking like a leaf before he got on stage. It's a totally intimidating experience. Jason is on stage because I convinced the guy on the right, Rob Jingle, who wrote the compromise letter with Apache, that he needed to convince the Apache community that this was real. So he needed a photographable moment on stage. And originally it was just going to be the two of them, and it was going to take 5 minutes between keynotes, and that was going to be great, right? And Jason was there at 6 in the morning to get mic'd, and he wasn't happy about it. And he, as we're walking across Howard Street at 6 in the morning, it's still a little dark, it was in March, Tracy Stout, who was in charge of branding, is walking across the street as well. And she says, "Oh, what are you doing up here this morning?" And I said, "Well, this is Jason Hunter. He's from Apache. He's going to talk about open source Java with Rob Jingle." And she says, "Oh, that's so very interesting." And then she goes to where she's going. We go to get him mic'd up. It turns out she's gone back to Scott McNeely's dressing room. And he is giving his keynote the same day. And he is mad as hell. He hates his speech. He's throwing cue cards, and he's saying, "I am the CEO of the best company in the world. There has got to be something more interesting than this to talk about." And his handlers are, shaking. And Tracy says, "Well, I ran into Denise on Howard Street, and she's got this kid from Apache here to talk about open source Java." So she comes, he wants him, right? So she comes toddling out to the front of the stage where we're standing, and she says, when he's just awestruck because he's standing there talking to Gosling, and she says, "Scott McNeely would like you to be in his keynote." And Jason says, "Do I want to do that to me?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you want to do that." So he goes back to meet Scott, and Gosling's looking at me, he goes, "That is incredibly stochastic, but how the hell," right? Because we couldn't get Sun to make another comment about Open Java. We'd been trying for months to get something to happen. And all of a sudden now, this guy on the left, that's Scott McNeely. And he actually stood on stage and said, "Oh, Java's going to be open source. That's so cool," which gave us another huge boost. Now I'm going to tell you a little secret about big conferences like Java One. When you work for the company that's putting on the conference, you have to sit in the middle of the front stage, like this lady is doing, to make sure that the keynoter is, okay. Because you have to heroically jump on stage if something bad happens. I don't know why, but at Java One, you end up with a whole block of people that work for Sun, and they're all kind of senior vice presidents and stuff, because in order to get that front row seat, you got to be pretty important. Or they're handling a speaker, like I was, like Jason. So I was sitting in the middle of the second row, because Jason was sitting in the middle of the first row, and I couldn't leave. Because if you get up and leave, it's the very beginning of Java One. Everybody's going to notice that you're leaving. They're all going to see you walk. So you just have to sit there. And there was no press set up for this announcement about open sourcing of Java, because they were trying to suppress this idea. So everybody is hating me. I can feel the hatred coming in waves over me after this moment. But it helped a lot, because it taught us how to do this. So we started Apache Geronimo, we being the Apache community, started Apache Geronimo, and about the time that it got good enough to actually use, Sun open source Glassfish. And we went, aha, this is how we do it. So a little bit later, we started Harmony, which didn't have a very good logo, so you got the town of Harmony. And just a little bit before, but you guys know the town of Harmony? Does anybody know where Harmony is? It's on a part of California called the Lost Coast. It used to be where all the weed in the world was grown. All right, that's why they're harmonious. So just a little bit after we got Harmony to a point where it could actually be usable, OpenJDK. It was like magic, right? Now, I had actually left Sun by the time the JDK was literally opened, and that was because when I signed on as a mentor to the Harmony project, JavaSoft tried to fire me. The truth is, somebody tried to fire me pretty much every quarter the whole time I was at Sun. But that particular quarter, I had already anticipated this move, and I had already taken a job working on OpenSolaris, because I knew what OpenSolaris' answer to the Java people would be if they tried to fire me. But at the end of the day, there were just too many eggs broken at Sun. I'd spent 6 years trying to force them to do this thing, and working on Harmony was the best way to move it along, so I went to Intel instead after a little while. And Intel ended up having to deal with a non-compete that Sun slapped on them. Pretty good for a French major, huh? And so I ended up doing a different project while I was at Intel. It's another completely weird and fascinating story. But imagine, you guys, part of the reason you want open languages is because you have no idea the weird machinations that are going on behind those closed doors. So Intel was tired of Microsoft. They were tired of Microsoft. They were tired of Bill calling them up, telling them what to do. So they gave me like $100 million in 3 years to figure out what it would cost to artificially ramp the adoption of desktop Linux over Windows so that they could get out of Microsoft jail. And we could do it anywhere except North America. We could do experiments. And we ended up giving like 1 million laptops away, all beautifully configured with a perfectly customized version of desktop Linux and all the tools that you would need. And we gave them to people who'd never had a computer before, so they didn't really have any reason not to like them. And it turns out, if you're a Chinese grandma and someone's just given you a computer and you don't really understand what it's doing, and you call your nephew, the amount of time that it's going to take for him to put Windows on that machine is vanishingly small. So what we discovered is you can't actually leapfrog over Windows because the install base is too deep and there's too much history there. What we told them was, in fact, you just have to beat them on the device market. If you beat them in devices, they'll never. If you never let them gain a foothold there, then they will effectively be done in a while here. Just take longer. And so you will watch that they'll never actually win. They should just give up now. Anyway, meanwhile, James Gosling, father of Java. I know you guys have seen this quote before, but I think it says a lot because I know James. This is a big admission for him. To say that Scala is as good to him as Java is really interesting. And I think that we inside of PayPal spend a lot of time trying to make this exact point because we are deeply bought into Java, but we own a Scala company, and a particularly good one, we think. They're very good at knowing how to curate the use of Scala for the kind of scale that we need to get so that they don't write themselves into any corners. We have 2 projects that we open sourced last year, Cascade and Horizon. Cascade's a framework, Horizon is I believe is the curation document. But basically what it tells you is why we think you want to set it up this way if you want to run at the kind of scale that PayPal has. And interestingly enough, we open sourced it so that we could convince PayPal to use it. And we'll tell you next year how that's going. Meanwhile, it's not just Java. How many of you guys know R? Anybody here? Good. You are the future. You all know that R is based on a language called S that was written at Bell Labs. Everybody knows that? No? Okay. Well, nobody cares about S anymore. There's a company called SAS that is the most proprietary company in the world. They're apparently really nice to their employees, but they charge an arm and a leg and 2 teeth for a license. But you could just use R. And everybody that you're going to hire to write in S has already learned R in school because of this guy, Robert Gentleman, and another guy named Robert Ikaika. So it's called R because their first names were Robert. But it also alphabetized above S, which is really interesting to me. So it was originally an academic language. It's GPL, it's complete ripoff of S. Like they didn't ask permission or anything. They just figured they were academics, nobody would care. And it's been taught, R has been used to teach every quant that has graduated in this country for the last 10 plus years. And they made it extensible, which S was not. And they made it possible to write models and share them. And so all the graduate work that's done in statistics is pretty much done in R. And lo and behold, it's won because there's no barrier to adopting it, but also you can tweak it, you can improve. You're not stuck with whatever the vendor's trying to sell you. I got this chart. This is the only actual data you're going to see. This is from O'Reilly. They gave it to me last night, and it is GitHub pushes in last year by language. So the big blue slice is JavaScript. Again, continues to dominate. Then we have going around the circle that way. Oh, I have a laser pointer. We have Python, Ruby, PHP, Java. Takes almost 3/4 of the circle for us to get to C++. And then C, and Objective-C, and C#. Perl still has a tiny slice about the same as R, which is amazing because R is kind of a boutique-y thing, And then Visual Basic down here with almost nothing. GitHub is the largest repository of code in the world, and you can argue that it's more likely to attract open source types, but because it is the largest repository, we can use it to extrapolate the popularity of languages. They got me another chart that was too late to put into my slides, but it also showed book sales, and the diff of book sales between 2014 and 2015 clearly shows JavaScript way out in front. It shows Java and Python next, and then C++. So again, the first 3 languages are open source languages, which I think, has to have something to do with There's no hidden agenda. Everybody can just use it. They can improve it if it needs improvement. So, oops, wrong button. There we go. And again, in the it's not just Java category, this is Miguel de Icaza. You guys know what he's famous for? For porting .NET and C# to Mono, which is the monkey in the top. The bottom one is the .NET logo. You know Microsoft just open sourced .NET. I guess nobody was using it, huh? It doesn't even show up in that earlier pie chart of pushes. It's, I think, probably too little too late, but Miguel fell in love with the beauty of the decorated parse tree, the idea of one engine to sort of parse every language. And he still thinks that this may win out. Of course, he thinks his open source version is going to win out, and I think he's probably right now that they've opened theirs. And then as another example, and one that I've been involved with a lot lately, we have Node.js, which is, of course, a scalable framework for JavaScript. Again, PayPal open sourced a thing called Kraken, which was our scaled out version of Node last year before last now, and to great acclaim, and it did everything that we wanted it to do. First, it did it inside our company, like we used a front end in Java, believe it or not. And it was painful and took too long. And this guy came in from Netflix and he said, there's this other tool you could be using. It's called Node. Let me, just run a little prototype test and see if it's more efficient. And he put like 5 engineers, and one of them was a girl, against 50 engineers coding the same work in Java, and they were so far ahead after the first 3 weeks that the Java developers were begging to be able to use Node. And interestingly enough, he had a lot of high-level meetings with the people who try to keep you from changing in big companies as he did this. And he's from Texas. He's really cute. He'd get in these meetings and they'd say, "What are you doing?" And he'd say, "I'm just prototyping. I'm just prototyping. You don't have to worry. I'm just prototyping." But he knew that he was going to win. So we have a pretty big stake in Node, and therefore we were a little concerned when we saw the IOJS project happen, which is a fork of Node. That is the engineers that are actually writing Node getting tired of the open source project not moving fast enough because it's got a benevolent dictator for life that works for a corporation that doesn't really understand how open source works. So they tried to play nice for a couple of years, I think, before they finally said, we can't do this anymore, and they jumped off the cliff, and they forked. Now, I've been trying, I and others have been trying to pull these two projects back together because the Node trademark is worth so much. We'd like the IOJS guys to get the benefit of it, but it's really been a lot of lifting the legacy BDFL company kind of out of the way. Like, could you just move out of the way because they don't need you? So this is the slide that tells you that even an open source language can screw it up. It's possible to get it wrong, even if it's an open source language, if you're not willing to be responsive enough to your community. So, all right, now we're down to the things that I really want you to learn from this talk. You're supposed to put them at the beginning and the end, but you guys are a bright crowd, so we're going to do it just once at the end. First of all, I think that open source is a requirement to drive language adoption at this point. If you guys are planning a new language, just open it. Don't try to monetize it. Don't drag some poor woman through 6 years of hell trying to get your project to actually be open source so that it can live. Open source it at the beginning. It's the only way to go now. And I would submit that a permissive license is a better choice than an unpermissive license, although there are pros and cons on both sides. But the reason that I say that is a permissive licenses say, we're not going to sue you, we just want you to use it. And that's probably a good thing. All right, second thing, it is possible to get it wrong. Listen to your developers. If you are the developers, be loud enough that they have to listen to you. Because usually developers have a pretty good sense of where things are trying to go and why, because they're actually trying to use it. They're not marketers, they're not trying to monetize, they're not worried about brand sanity. They just want the thing to work and they want people to use it. So it's really possible to get it wrong. This is the big lesson these days for Node. And then open standards is not the same as open source. There are a lot of companies that will tell you that that's the case. Some companies, so the term open standards doesn't actually have a definition anywhere. Open source is really clearly defined. riffing on the original 4 freedoms that Richard Stallman wrote for the free software community, we have 10 really clear guidelines for what a license has to do to be open source. Here still, 15 years later, we're still fighting with companies who think that their business case is so special and so unique that they need one of these 10 things not to be true. And we continue to say, I'm sorry, that's just not open source. It just isn't. But open standards doesn't really have a definition. We said at OSI a while back, we said an open standard is a standard that can be freely implementable in open source, which implies that it's got no licensing encumbrances, no onerous fees to get access to it. It's licensed in such a way that you can just use it. But the standards community didn't like that because, because that included de facto standards. And de facto standards are scary if you're in a standards body, because although everybody in God is using them, they haven't, been sitting in a room. There's no big book of specific, precise specifications that describe how this thing works. I see de facto standards, especially in the internet world, really being the way that work is done. And I've talked to an awful lot of the people that are inventing technology these days who are really frustrated with the standards game. So I just want to remind you that open standards is not the same as open source. And I want you to say that as often as you can to the people that you work for who don't understand this point. Just a sec. All right. And now we're to questions. Whew. I imagine some of you have questions. Questions, and I'd be very happy to answer them. And then I could stop talking for a second. So come on, somebody have a question? No? He's going to get a handheld mic. You could use those.
Hi.
Hi.
So one of the challenges with open source within a company is that it's not enough to just ship the source. You also have to do all of the investment on community building and maintenance and support, and it's a lot harder to do that in our experience with something that's outside of the company and maintaining all of that constant attention on it than it is within the company. Even within the company where we're handling things in kind of an open source fashion where lots of people are contributing and we have open processes and so on. Are there any really good patterns for doing that well?
There are. First, there's a great book called Producing Open Source Software, written by a colleague of mine named Carl Fogel. You can get it online for free in its current version. He's about to rev it, and he did a Kickstarter to get the next version out. So it was written before there was GitHub. So it doesn't talk about distributed models and things like that, but the basic stuff in there is right. It is hard for companies to change the way that they do things, but I would argue that it's actually really healthy for companies to get a thought for how outside developers feel about the way that they do things. So the hardest thing you have to do is realize that you need to set it up so that the outside world has an equal chance of contributing to your thing. You can't just bundle a bunch of changes and throw them over the wall every so often. You have to actually do your engineering outside. And in that respect, it's not that much different than the way that you would, join an Apache project. You'd be doing your engineering outside and with some of your big competitors in a nice little watering hole. So my best advice is spend a lot of time thinking about what it would be like to be outside the company, trying to be a community member, and try to bring everything down to that point. What I tell people inside of PayPal when we look at an open source project, first I say, does anybody outside care? I mean anybody. Bring me one person who cares if we open this project. And they always say, but we would have to tell them what we're going to do. And I'm like, exactly. Go to a conference, talk about what you wrote, suggest that if there was enough interest, we might open source it, and see if anybody cares. And if nobody cares, then you don't need to open source it because you can't be building any community behind it. Then the next question, these are the 4 questions. The next question is, do we still use it? You'd be surprised how many companies are still trying to gain a good name for themselves in open source by throwing out something that we don't even use anymore. And what kind of story is that? Usually not a great one. Then the third one is it resourced? And specifically, will there be people answering questions if a community wants to know how things were done? Ideally, we like to export, if we're going to set up an open source project, we like to set up the whole project. Like, we like to leave the history in there so that people can research in the pull requests and find out why things happened the way they did. We like to put the backlog out if there is one so that they can see what's coming next. This is a lot of transparency for most companies, but if you do these steps, you actually have a chance of pulling it off. And then the last one is, if you can say yes to those three things, can't we just, after we open source it, work live on that tree that's outside? Can we modularize whatever our secret sauce is so that we can slap it on as though this project didn't belong to us? And if you can say yes to those four things, you might have a chance of pulling it off. It is a big shift, though, and that's why there are people like Carl who would be very happy to come into your company and help you understand how to do that. That was my role before PayPal hired me, and I wasn't looking to work for PayPal, frankly, but they have a really unique situation going on there. They have a lot of stuff they want to open source. They want to do it for the right reasons. My biggest problem is getting them not to try to do it all at once and to not do things that nobody cares about, because to them, every baby is beautiful, right? So that's one problem. And then the other problem is getting them to do that engineering outside, because they're so used to being behind a firewall. But it's good work. It's worth doing. And they're also very interested in retooling their internal engineering using open process, which it sounds like you're already doing. And I'm really interested in seeing if you can teach an old company how to do that. So that's what I'm doing there. But was that helpful? Good. Next question. Let's take this guy over here. Oh, you first? Okay.
Yeah, I guess I'll go next. So I have, interacted with a lot of people and worked with some of them that are at companies that are very concerned about open sourcing anything that they do, because, in their mind, they're concerned about devaluing the product that they're building itself, like their thing that they're taking to market and selling, and, even if there are a lot of components that may have been developed in-house that are ancillary to that are not part of the secret sauce, as you might say, there's still kind of this culture of being afraid of that. Have you dealt with that? And if so, like, how have you kind of addressed it, like in these companies that you've been involved with?
Well, I used to just throw my body in front of the train repeatedly. Right? I did. That's what I did at Sun. It's surprising how much easier it is these days, but you have to come up with a strategy that makes sense to them. And there are really three reasons that companies do open source, but the best of those three is so they do it for reputation. But obviously, if they're not going to do it right, reputation's a bad reason to do it, right? They do it to disrupt. And sometimes even if they screw it up, the disruption thing happens. And that's usually the most attractive version of why. So if you look at why really closed companies do open source occasionally, like the health kit thing that Apple just did, right? Why would they do that, given how closed they are? Well, WebKit worked pretty well for them, right? At establishing that everybody do things the way that they wanted it done. That's a really good reason to do it. But that fear thing is you have to look at who's making the decisions and why. When you assess how likely it is that a company's going to get it right. And even then, sometimes it doesn't happen. I did a consulting gig with a famous nonprofit in the Washington state area, richest nonprofit in the world, who had every reason to get it right. What was I doing there? I feel bad about beating up Microsoft for so long, and I thought, well, this is the nonprofit side of this company. Maybe I can, the problem is that culturally they're still that other company, and they can't let go enough. Everything in their DNA tells them that when the going gets rough, they should tighten the screws. And it just doesn't work, So you have to make a real assessment of whether your company is even able to deal with it. Usually they're best able to do it on the edges first, because that doesn't matter as much. And sometimes after they've done the edge work, they get it, how it works, and they're better at doing the bigger things. Again, if Sun had been able to get out of its own way to do Java and Solaris much earlier, things would have been really different for them. But they were so hung up on, in the case of Java, monetizing, and in the case of Solaris, getting all that spaghetti out of the way so that it was, something they could really open. Those processes took a decade, and that's too bad. So, did that help? Okay. Now it's your turn.
What do you think about some of the different models for financing open source? A lot of times you've got companies that will be like sponsors, or you've got foundations, or you've got some project that kind of grows up from the grassroots and then tries to attract funding. Which do you think has been the most successful, or just the overall best way of financing open source? Also, there's the commercial with a dual license kind of model.
Right. So dual license has been really effective for a few projects. MySQL famously grew up that way. And then the project that's most effective at it now is MongoDB. They've chosen a license that's basically poisonous to software as a service implementations, but their tool's really useful. And so people go write a side license with them. And they set it up that way on purpose, so that people would come for that side license. The trick there is you have to have a tool everybody wants, or you can't hold them hostage like that, right? So I am a big fan of the foundation. I've been an Apache member for 10 years. I've taken a lot of projects through Apache, been involved with Mozilla for a long time. And in fact, we helped Mozilla become a foundation because AOL was going to pull the plug, and IBM and Sun went and convinced them that would be a bad idea. Given that we were in the middle of suing Microsoft for their Internet Explorer stuff, we needed a free browser really bad. So we threw a little money in, and anyway, that foundation exists partly because of their deal with Google. They're very richly endowed. I think that the foundation thing keeps the books open, it keeps transparency in how things are run, and you have a better chance of gaining a level playing field that way. Sponsorship, it would have to be a very special company to do that well. I've seen that done poorly a lot of times now. And we keep having to fix that problem because inevitably the business needs of the company supersede whatever it is that the community needs, and it causes problems and often causes forks. If you want to see an example of the dual license thing gone wrong, look at Eucalyptus, which I don't know if you guys know this story, but Eucalyptus is the next project that Martin Miko set up. He was the guy who was the business mind behind MySQL. And he set it up very similarly in terms of how he wanted it to work. So there was a loss leader product that was available. It wasn't fully featured, but you could have it for free. And NASA took it and they made it performant. And then they tried to give their changes back, and Eucalyptus wouldn't take them because it kind of screwed up their business model. So NASA, put it out at SourceForge, and the Rackspace people picked it up, and now it's OpenStack, and it's eating Eucalyptus's lunch. So it's arguable that only works if you really have a product everybody needs, and that would be too hard for somebody else to build, right? I kind of like the idea of crowdfunding, although there's a fulfillment problem there. There's been a lot of crowdfunded open source stuff that then never actually gets to where the people who gave it money hope that it's going to go. So that's problematic too, I think. So I'm really a big fan of foundations. I like grassroots, but I like once it gets big enough for anybody to care, I want it in a foundation because otherwise the monetization wolves will tear it to shreds. And that's never pretty. So you got to come to the microphone. Yeah.
Hi. What's your opinion on the general idea of the contributor license agreement, like work for hire, and the some employment clause that says, we own everything you write, even
I
after
know
5 o'clock?
so much about this problem. So how many of you work in California or for companies that are headquartered in California? Okay. You're going to love what I'm about to tell you. The idea of signing a pre-invention agreement does not apply to you. There's good, strong case law in California that says that you can work on a project that is even close to what your employer does, as long as you do it with your own materials on your own time. So if you're working on a startup that is somehow close to what you are paid to do, just make sure you document that you're using your own equipment and you're doing it on your own time. They can't actually own your mind, despite what your hiring agreement tells you. This is true in 7 states in America. Having said that, the CLA, or Contributor Licensing Agreement, which was first put in place by the Free Software Foundation, and they had a very aggressive agreement that basically said, we are taking your copyrights and you don't have them anymore. But we're the Free Software Foundation and you trust us, right? Then when Sun started doing them, we did a CLA that was more like the Apache CLA that said, we're just asking for a license to the copyrights so that we can serve them, because US copyright law says that if you get into a lawsuit, you have to assemble 51% of the representation of the ownership. And if you've already done that, it just saves a couple steps, because copyright law is really swift. If they get an injunction, it's the fastest way to stop something being distributed, so you have to be able to move really quickly. Now, you're giving a measure of trust to the people that are aggregating your copyrights, and sometimes it turns out badly, as we saw with Sun getting sold to Oracle and everything that happened there. But the long and short of it is, aggregating copyright is just sound copyright practice if the project is likely to ever have to go to court. And again, we haven't really been tried in court yet. This is a relatively young thing, open source, and there's only been a handful of cases that even touched us. So we know that the licenses are a little flaky in some ways. It's a novel interpretation of copyright law. It's not inconceivable that a court would go the other way, but it's less conceivable if the copyrights are aggregated and somebody like IBM can do what they did with SCO, where they just said, no, we're taking it all the way. We want a real decision because we need some landmark case law here. Having said all of that, there's a movement now to do away with CLAs because they clearly say, go ask your lawyer. And if you work for a company, that's probably your corporate lawyer, and you may have trouble convincing them because they may not understand why you want the right to do this. To something called a DCO, I think it's called, which is the click-through that you do in Git if you are trying to get into the Linux kernel. So there's a little click-through that says, you have the right to give this, and you click it and you say, yes, I do, and it goes. But it's happening without your lawyer getting a review cycle. There's a lot of projects that are loving that closeness to the developer community, and there are lawyers who are tearing their hair out about whether this is a good idea or not. And the jury's still out. I actually chaired a panel at OSCON last year on exactly this issue, and I thought that we were going to have a lively debate because I had somebody from the free software movement and somebody from Apache, Brian Bellendorf, and I thought that they were going to argue about why it's important to aggregate copyrights. But Brian completely laid over and said, well, maybe it's time for the CLA to go away. And in the room were representatives of all the big companies and their open source side, right? Nobody said anything because it was filmed. And as soon as the cameras were off and we were out in the hallway, there's this whole other session that happened where the companies are screaming at the 3 panelists going, we can't do away with the CLA. We need that minute where we think about the legal implications of being involved in this project. So I'd say that debate's not over yet. But the HIP projects are heading for this, the developer's going to attest, or they're taking it away completely and saying, we'll just have disaggregated copyright and we'll see what happens. Now, when Mozilla never has had aggregation in their copyrights, and when they wanted to add the LGPL a few years ago, it took them 2.5 years to get enough of the ownership of the code to say yes to that change. So that's the downside, is it makes it harder to make changes. But there are people who argue that the Linux kernel would have been taken more seriously if it'd been all organized about collecting copyrights and holding them and all that stuff. Ever since Linus has been working for what is now called the Linux Foundation, they have been aggregating those rights. It's just the years before that weren't covered. So what I'm telling you is it's an open question. It's definitely a watch this space thing. If you're in a community that's wondering about this, I would have somebody lay out all the issues to the community and have a debate and try to decide what the right thing to do for that community is. Okay? That help?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi.
So there are actually microphones going around the room.
Oh, perfect.
As an FYI.
Thank you.
So my question, I've been involved with companies that have, that are doing proprietary stuff and are like, well, here we have this tiny little project over here, or maybe this not so tiny project, and, we want to open source this someday, but we want to make sure it's ready before we open source it. And I mean, that just seems to be a really, really common thing. And I can see both sides of it, because like you want to make sure it's good when you put it out there, and so you can actually build that critical mass really and get your momentum early on. But I can also see, well, set the cultural tenor early, right? Do your development in the open, and let the community shape you. I mean, what are your thoughts on the trade-offs with that? How do you see it working?
As a rule, you have to have at least a kernel of something. You can't just say, put a specification on the wall and say, we're going to build this now. Even Linus built a basic kernel before he said, would anybody like to help me here? Because it's just too hard to get something started from nothing. Having said that, I'm always in favor of the community starting relatively early. We say release early, release often. It's really hard for companies to understand that. It's good. I tell companies when I consult with them, it's really good to be strategically humble about this. And what you're doing by withholding it and polishing it until it really shines is kind of showing hubris, and it's misplaced. What you would do better to do is go through your code, figure out where you would like to rewrite it, tag that, and throw it out there and see what happens. But it's hard for companies to get past the idea that they're going to embarrass themselves out in the public. I think it's survivable. I mean, even Mozilla was pretty embarrassing in its first iteration. It took weeks to read it, and understanding it was harder. But they prevailed. You learn a ton about how to write from trying to get people to use your stuff in a raw state. What I do at PayPal is I have them soft launch. Excuse me. I have them soft launch, which means I have them put the code out, but not really tell too many people. We don't do big press release, because you only get one chance to have people look at your code, and if there's nothing happening there, if it's crickets when they get there, they're not going to come back. So remember I told them they have to start talking about the project before we decide whether we're going to open source it? We reach out to the people who were interested. We try to bring them in. We try to get a community started, and then we start talking about it. So we did 9 projects last year, but we didn't do press releases about any of them. We're going to do that this year, now that there's something to say. But again, part of the reason I'm at PayPal is because they're willing to listen to me when I say stuff like this. It's always interesting to see whether your company will even hear what you're saying when you say, wouldn't you rather join something where there's something left to do? Right? So that's what I think.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yeah. Okay. I think you're the last question. So.
I was wondering if you're seeing open source concepts take traction in other industries, like some of the stuff like Toyota is doing with the open fuel cell, maybe Facebook's open hardware, stuff like that. I was just wondering if you're actually seeing tractions in other industries around open source.
Yeah, I actually wrote a book about this for O'Reilly, 2007, I think. And that was already significant traction in every area of human endeavor almost. I mean, I don't know if you listened to the inaugural, or the process of Obama becoming president, but when he won his first election and gave his victory speech in Chicago, CNN was, of course, covering every second of that night because it was election night. And right after they were done with his speech, they switched to a panel of people. And the first guy who talked was a Republican analyst. And he very succinctly, and it did my heart such good, he very succinctly said, well, out there in Silicon Valley, there's this thing called open source. And if you're curious about it, you can read The Cathedral and the Bazaar by Eric Raymond. But basically, Obama wants to be the open source president. And I was like, oh my God. Then he said, unfortunately, Washington doesn't really work that way. And he's going to find that out. But so even politics, amazingly enough. I've seen it in science. I've seen it in medicine. I've seen it in weird places like sports. Extreme sports is an open source thing. The people who build the apparatus of extreme sports, like the best sailboard, the best skateboard, they don't do any R&D. They just let the practitioners modify their own boards, and then they notice what works and they mass produce it. So in that way, it's open source, right? It's everywhere you want to be. And you know, it does me and Tim and people like us a lot of good, because there are about a dozen of us that traveled around the world. Like, I did 350,000 miles a year for 10 years, talking to anybody about open source to convince them that this was really happening. They should change their curriculum to include open source. They should invest in it as a company or as a government. And there's still people doing that work today. Last year, the UK decided that open document format was going to be their default format for archival documents going forward. Oh my God. You know, we worked on that one for a really long time. But we are seeing it show up everywhere, and we're seeing it become more and more ubiquitous as an idea, but there's a danger in that. There's a whole generation of developers younger than you guys, well, not younger than you, but younger than most of you guys, who just think that open source comes with the package. They don't understand that it costs something to make it happen, and they're willing to compromise. So that's why we're seeing another crop of, wait, we want to change the licensing. Because they don't understand that all of those 10 principles are really important. You know, the right to fork is the most important thing and the scariest thing, because it means that your invention could be co-opted. It forces you to continue to innovate and continue to be edgy, continue to push forward instead of, you know, sitting back and resting. But the whole internet forces you to do that. They just haven't woken up and realized that yet. So I think it might be time to update open sources. It was called Open Sources 2, and you can still get it from O'Reilly, and probably for free at Safari U by now. But I think that it's probably time for Open Sources 3, because it's getting even bigger now in terms of the directions that people are going. Open architecture is really interesting to me. So if you were building housing for very poor people, wouldn't it be cool if the best architects in the world were designing the thing that you're going to mass produce? And maybe even you were getting iteration on that through an open process. That's totally happening, which I find, you know, amazing. So yeah, I think that open source has rippled far and wide, and I'm really gratified to have been part of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for your time.
Denise, just
Yeah.
before you leave, there were a couple of people who didn't get to ask questions. Will you be around to have chats and stuff later?
I'm going to stick around at least until lunch, so I'll be here. I have a black hat.
Great, thank you.